The doctor leaned closer to the lantern, his pen hovering over the page. The old man on the cot had not blinked in nearly a minute. His pupils were the colour of wet slate, sunk deep into a face the miners had described as more bark than skin. When he finally spoke, his voice came out cracked and slow, shaped by a tongue that had not formed proper words in decades. He said he remembered the river before the locks. He said he remembered the year the British burned the capital. He said he had been 12 years old when his father carried him out of a city that no longer appeared on any map. The doctor stopped writing. He set the pen down. He looked at the foreman standing in the doorway and asked him very quietly to close the door and to tell no one outside this room what they were about to hear. By the time the sun rose over the Allegheny Ridge, 3 men had been sworn to silence, and the old man had begun to weep without sound, because for the first time in over 80 years, someone had asked him his name. The date was October 14th, 1893. The location was a collapsed gallery in the lower workings of the Bramble Hollow coal mine, roughly 9 miles southeast of Kittanning, Pennsylvania, in the broken country where the Allegheny River carves its oldest channels. A crew of 14 miners had been working a new seam when their picks broke through into what they first believed was a natural void. The air that rolled out of the opening was dry and strangely warm, and it carried a smell the foreman would later describe as old paper and lamp oil. What they found inside that void would never appear in any official report filed with the Pennsylvania Department of Mines. The shift logs for that week were rewritten twice. The foreman, a man named Caleb Orrin Fletcher, would resign within 6 months and move his family to Ohio, where he refused for the rest of his life to speak about what he had seen that morning. But Fletcher kept a private journal. That journal surfaced in 1971 in the estate sale of his granddaughter, and the entries from October of 1893 are why this story can be told at all. According to Fletcher's account, the breach in the wall was no larger than a doorway, but the chamber beyond it was vast. His lantern light reached perhaps 30 feet before it dissolved into a darkness that seemed to drink the flame. The floor was packed dirt, but it was level in a way that natural caves are never level. There were timber beams overhead, hand-hewn and pegged, blackened by age but still sound. There were what appeared to be the remains of crates stacked along one wall, and the rotted leather of what might once have been harnesses or straps. And in the far corner, curled against a low shelf cut into the rock, was a human shape. At first the miners thought it was a body. The skin was the colour of tallow and stretched so tightly across the bones that the ribs and collarbones stood out like the slats of a barrel. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The hair was long and white and matted into thick ropes that fell past the shoulders. The fingernails had grown into yellow curls. Fletcher wrote that he had stepped forward to inspect what he was certain were human remains when the figure drew a breath. One of the younger miners screamed and dropped his pick. Another crossed himself and backed against the wall. Fletcher, to his credit, knelt down. He held the lantern close and watched as the creature on the shelf slowly turned its head toward the light. The eyes opened. They were lucid, they were aware, and they were terrified. The miners carried him out wrapped in a horse blanket. He weighed, by Fletcher's estimate, no more than 70 pounds. He did not struggle. He did not speak. When the daylight at the mine entrance struck his face, he made a sound that one of the men described as the cry of a calf separated from its mother, and then he closed his eyes and did not open them again until he had been laid on a cot in the foreman's office and given water boiled with sugar. The company sent for Dr. Eliphalet Penn, a physician from Kittanning who served as the mine surgeon. Penn arrived shortly after noon. His written examination, which Fletcher copied into his journal in full, records a man of indeterminate age, severely underweight, with skin that had clearly not been exposed to sunlight in a span measured in years rather than months. His teeth were largely intact, though stained dark. His joints were stiff but functional. There were no signs of recent injury. There were, however, scars on his back and forearms that Penn described as consistent with very old burns, perhaps decades old, healed into pale ridges. And there was one detail that Penn underlined twice in his original notes. The man's tongue showed signs of disuse so severe that when he first attempted speech, the muscles cramped, and he had to be given warm broth and massaged at the jaw before any clear syllables could form. When he did speak, he spoke English, but it was not the English of 1893. The cadence was older, slower, and his vocabulary was strewn with words that Penn at first mistook for the mumblings of a damaged mind. He used the word kine for cattle. He spoke of a fortnight rather than 2 weeks. He referred to lucifer matches as if they were a recent and suspicious invention. He asked in his second hour of consciousness whether General Brock had taken Detroit, and when Fletcher told him gently that General Brock had been dead for 81 years, the old man went silent for the better part of an hour. When he resumed speaking, he gave his name. He said he had been called Ambrose Wendell Carrick. He said his father had been a tinsmith in a city he called Allegheny Court, and that his mother had died of a fever the same summer the comet came, which Penn later calculated to be either 1811 or early 1812. He described his childhood city in considerable detail. He described wide stone avenues laid out in geometric patterns. He described buildings with copper roofs and tall arched windows fronted by colonnades. He described a great central square with a fountain that ran day and night, fed by water that came, he said, from beneath the ground without any visible pump. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. He described a system of bells that rang the hours from a tower at the centre of the city, and gas lamps along the streets that lit themselves at dusk. None of this matched any settlement ever recorded in western Pennsylvania. Fletcher pressed him on the location. The old man grew agitated. He said the city had been there where the 3 rivers met before there was a Pittsburgh. He said Pittsburgh was a name the new people had given to the site after the old city had been broken open and buried. He used that phrase repeatedly. Broken open and buried. He said the lower stories of the old buildings were still down there, beneath the soot and brick of the new town, and that anyone who dug a deep enough cellar in the older neighbourhoods would strike a wall that had been standing before the first English maps of the region were drawn. He told Penn that the wall would not look like anything a frontier settler could have laid. It would be cut stone, fitted without mortar, with joints so tight a knife could not slip between them. Penn, writing in his own private notes, recorded that he initially believed the old man to be suffering from a kind of long-term confinement psychosis, a fantasy world constructed during decades of solitude. But 3 things stopped him from dismissing the testimony outright. First, Carrick's vocabulary, frozen at a point before the War of 1812, was internally consistent and accurate in ways a delusional mind could not easily fabricate. Second, the scars on his back, examined again under stronger light, formed a pattern that resembled falling masonry rather than fire alone. And third, when Carrick was asked to draw the layout of his childhood city on a sheet of butcher paper, he produced a radial street plan with 8 spokes converging on a central plaza, a design that bore no relation to any American city of the early 19th century, but which closely matched the ground plans of certain old-world citadels Penn had seen in an engineering manual during his medical training. Carrick was kept in the foreman's office for 11 days. During that time he ate gruel and soft bread, gained perhaps 4 pounds, and spoke at length with Fletcher, Penn, and a third man, a Methodist minister named Reverend Tobias Hale, who had been summoned to provide spiritual counsel. The transcripts of those conversations, as copied by Fletcher, filled nearly 40 pages of his journal. Carrick spoke of the night the city died. He said it began with a sound like a long roll of thunder that did not stop. He said the ground heaved and the copper roofs buckled and the central tower collapsed inward as if something beneath it had been pulled away. He said there was no fire. Not at first. The fire came later, when the new arrivals burned what was left to clear the ground for their settlements. He said his father had carried him through a sewer that was not a sewer but a stone tunnel large enough for 2 carts abreast, lit at intervals by what his father called sky stones, smooth discs set into the ceiling that gave off a steady cold light without any flame Carrick could see. He said they had emerged in the wooded hills to the east, where a man took them in and hid them in a root cellar for the better part of a year. He said the man asked no questions and never spoke of what he had seen, the night the sky turned the colour of beaten copper and the horizon to the west glowed for 3 days afterward. He said his father died of his injuries the following spring. He said the man who had sheltered them was the one who eventually brought him to the Allegheny country, where as a boy of 15 he had been taken in by a family of charcoal burners. And he said that one day when he was perhaps 20 years old, he had wandered into a cave looking for shelter from a storm, and the cave had closed behind him in a slide of earth, and he had survived on a spring that wept from one wall, and on the roots and mushrooms that grew in the dark, and on the contents of crates that had been stored in the chamber long before he arrived. He could not say how many years he had lived in that chamber. He said the dark was the same every day. He said he had stopped counting after the candles ran out. He said the crates had contained dried fish wrapped in waxed cloth, hard biscuits in tin canisters, and bundles of tallow tapers that he had used only when he needed to inspect a sound. He said something small and 4-legged had lived in the chamber with him for a time, that came to drink from the spring, and that he had eventually killed and eaten when his strength began to fail. After that, he had been alone. On the 12th day, 2 men in dark suits arrived at the mine office. Fletcher recorded their visit in a single guarded paragraph. He wrote that they identified themselves as representatives of a historical society based in Philadelphia, and that they presented documents bearing seals he did not recognize. They spoke privately with the mine superintendent for nearly an hour. When they emerged, the superintendent informed Fletcher that Ambrose Wendell Carrick was to be transferred that evening to a facility where he could receive proper care. Fletcher protested. He pointed out that Carrick had begun to regain his strength, and that moving him by carriage at night, in October weather, was likely to kill him. The superintendent told Fletcher the matter was no longer his concern. Carrick was taken out of the office at dusk, wrapped in heavier blankets, and loaded into a closed coach drawn by 4 horses. Fletcher watched the coach until its lanterns vanished around the bend of the road. He never saw Ambrose Wendell Carrick again. He made inquiries in the months that followed. He wrote to historical societies in Philadelphia and Harrisburg. He received either no response or polite letters informing him that no such society existed at the address the visitors had given. The mine office records for October of 1893 were missing the relevant pages when Fletcher checked them the following spring. Dr. Penn's original examination notes were requested by a man claiming to be a state medical inspector and were never returned. Reverend Hale died of pneumonia that December. Fletcher kept his own journal locked in a strongbox until his death in 1939. What are we to make of Ambrose Wendell Carrick? A lunatic, perhaps, dragged half dead from a hole in the ground, his mind weaving fantasies out of the books he had heard read aloud as a child. That is the simplest explanation, and it is the one any cautious historian would reach for first. But there are details that resist it. The radial city plan he drew on butcher paper, the pre-1812 vocabulary that no isolated confinement could have preserved with such precision, the scars consistent with falling stone, the visitors in dark suits who arrived with sealed documents and took him into a darkness that the historical record never reopens. And there is the broader pattern, which anyone who studies the founding maps of American cities begins to notice eventually. The geometric street grids that predate the supposed founding dates. The Cyclopean foundation stones that turn up in cellar excavations beneath buildings nominally raised in the 1840s. The persistent local legends from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati to St. Louis of older towns buried in the soil, of bricks and copper sheeting unearthed by farmers in fields no settler had built upon. The official history tells us that the interior of North America was a wilderness until European hands made it otherwise. Ambrose Wendell Carrick, if his testimony is to be believed, was a child of the city that stood where Pittsburgh now stands, and he survived its destruction by accident, and he was found again by accident, and he was taken away by men whose names and authority no record now confirms. Caleb Orrin Fletcher believed him. Dr. Eliphile Penn, by the end of those 11 days, believed him. They both went to their graves believing him. And the journal that survived them, locked in its strongbox for over 70 years, is why on this night, more than a century later, you and I are speaking his name aloud. Ambrose Wendell Carrick, born around 1800 in a city that does not appear on any map, pulled from the earth in 1893, vanished into a closed coach on an October evening, and remembered at last here.